Welcome in to Make Your Money Matter. I'm your host, Brad Barrett. And as we do every year over the past couple of years, our first show of the new year here in 2024, we want to take a look at what happened last year in the markets, and in particular, the capital markets, as well as I think it's a great time to reset when we start thinking about the new year, new you mentality and what you should be looking for in 2024 with some themes, if you will, that we're going to go through. And we're going to glean on a lot of, again, what happened last year and talk about what the quote experts have said. But before we get started, make sure to smash that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. All right, let's get started. Now, in thinking about the setup for the first episode of the new year here in 2024, I want to talk about a story that I read a little while ago that I think was perfect in the setup of what I want to share today. It was actually from Golf Magazine. Now, I'm not the biggest golfer in the world. I'm not expecting you guys to be either, but this might resonate for those who are. But Golf Magazine's top teachers in 1997 were quoted. I'm going to mention a couple of them here. David Ledbetter, Dick Harmon, and Johnny Myers. They were quoted about talking about none other than Tiger Woods. Now, this is what they had to say in 1997. David Ledbetter went on to say, Tiger is a tremendously talented athlete, but unfortunately, athleticism doesn't make one a winner right now. Tiger is a one-dimensional player who swings full on practically every shot. Crazy, right? Now, Dick Harmon went on to say, Tiger will win one tour event and do well to finish in the top 30. He then said he's not ready to handle the pressure of a major. Now, 2 months after this was written in 1997, Tiger Woods won the Masters tournament in Augusta by not just winning it, he won it by 12 shots. So here's the theme for this week's show. Tune out the naysayers. They're clueless in golf and in the investment world, right? And I always tell the investors to look out the window, right? The reality is we have to live sometimes to realize what's happening. There's an old saying in our business where it's like one analyst will say it's raining, one analyst will say it's not, and the investor really should just poke his head out the window, right? By the way, this is not just true of your money, this is true of life. Now, when I say they're clueless experts, last year, the beginning of 2023, so basically a year ago this week, what some of the quote unquote experts were saying was actually kind of astounding. Barclays assumed the S&P 500 was going to be down negative 4%. Morgan Stanley said it might do 1%. Citigroup said 1%. Bank of America, crazy, they say the S&P 500 for 2023 would be up 4%. Goldman went out to say 4%. Wells Fargo, coming in as the biggest one, said they would do 12%. Friends, I know we're playing Monday morning quarterback here, but if you look back into a year ago and looked at all the predictions I just mentioned by all the experts, just to see how wrong everyone was, you can see, right, that they were way off. I mean, the S&P 500 went up double digits in the mid-20s for all of 2023. Managed portfolios were in the teens and high teens. Most of these experts were sitting here at negative, 4%, negative 1%, or even top 12%. These are the experts, right? By the way, it's not a knock on any of these experts or these banks. I'm not saying these institutions I just mentioned aren't valid by any means, but it's the reality, I think, to look at, right? This is a reminder that even the experts or analysts or whoever you think you're following, are clueless, all right? And I've shared this often. If you ever find an advisor or someone, even on a show like this that you're watching in the investment world, who says exactly what's going to happen or predict, this, that, or the other, please run. Look, it's not facts to understand that you are hypothesizing of what you may or may not think is going to happen. No one knows what's going to happen tomorrow other than the holy above. And me saying that is just a reminder that no one knows the future. It doesn't matter how credible they may seem, what their resume is. It doesn't matter if they're talking about the stock market, homes, cryptocurrency, or anything else. It's impossible to know what will happen tomorrow. We know this at our core. I know you know this subliminally. I know it well. Yet in the money world, I feel like sometimes we get dragged along by certain things that just sound really good and shiny. And I see this all the time because it doesn't stop people out there, experts, quote unquote, from making these predictions, which is why you'll hear from me if you're a client listening here or any one of our advisors here. We don't make predictions. We're not in the prediction game. We're about proper planning, proper diversification, and managing all the risks that come across our clients' portfolios throughout the year. You've probably heard me, say this before if you listen to our show, and I always like, the first couple of weeks of the new year to talk about this because I think our minds are a little more clear. We're outside of the holidays, the busyness of all last year, all the rhetoric, even of the narrative that was going on. We have really a Monday morning quarterback or a hindsight to looking back. We all know hindsight's 2020, But we can look back and say, okay, what did we learn from last year? Well, we learned, as I just shared, that this year, by the way, same predictions are going on the same things, right? The reality is we want to stay the course. You hear me say this all the time as well, okay? It's not about timing the market, it's about time in the market. Get started right now. If you're thinking, okay, I want to do something different. My goal is to create a side hustle or buy a new property or rental or something like that. That's all great. I'm not saying to not do that, but sometimes you should say this, right? Before you go buy another house, make sure your current house is in order, right? Before going and investing in some other investment, right? Make sure your current investments are maxed out. Case in point, you got a retirement plan maybe you're contributing to? Great, that's good. But are you maxing out? Ask that first before you start deploying your cash or your investments elsewhere. Max out or fill up the buckets where you have it available, right? Those are the kind of things that actually matter. Get rid of the headwind. I mean, if you will, to clear out some space for you to actually succeed. That's really how it comes down to when it comes to your money. Now, I shared this stat a couple times last year, but I think it's important, and I updated it because if you look over the past 40 years, and I always use that reference recently for two reasons. One, it's not 100 years ago, right? So it's not like some big body of work. You're like, well, Brad, geez, it was much different in the 1930s. And I agree with you. But in the past 40 years, right, not only is it not that long of a comparison, right, to like 100 years ago, but secondarily, many of us listening here or watching here have lived through the last 30 or 40 years. And I share this because one other reason I would add is that the last time the US saw inflation that we have right now and even from last year, which is a big topic over the past really 2 years, the last time we've seen this was about 40 years ago. And since then, since 40 years, this is context, right? We've seen 6 recessions. And yes, we might be going into our 7th. We'll talk about that later on our show, right? And whether the NBER calls that or not, we'll get into that. But we've seen 6 bear markets. We've seen 45 or so federal rate hikes. We've seen 2 50% stock market crashes. We've seen 12 or 13 US involved wars. We've seen a global pandemic. We've seen a great financial crisis, which was a part of one of the 50% stock crises. I mean, by the way, the 250% in particular, that's an anomaly in any time period. And that happened in the last 20 years. And since then, the last 40 years, all that time period, we're still double-digit positive for the S&P 500, around 10%. So think about that for a second, because I don't know, where or who I'm speaking to right now, but I don't care if you're in your 20s or your 40s, or maybe even your 50s or 60s, that time period I just mentioned to you still applies to you. You might be thinking, well, wait a minute, Brad. Wait a minute. I'm about to retire. I'm 60 years old. How does a 30 or 40 year time horizon apply to me? Well, pretty simply stated, the same amount of time you had during your accumulation or working years, you would like in retirement. I've been a financial advisor for nearly 2 decades, and I've yet to ever run a plan. Thousands of plans I've run, or a retirement plan, where the person says, hey, I want to run a retirement plan where I want to basically call it quits after 12 months. So only run it for a year. Hasn't happened. Now, not to say it wouldn't, but it just hasn't happened yet. And I don't know if that's you, but I doubt you're going to run a plan and save and work so hard to put money aside just to live for like 1 or 2 years. We don't plan to retire and just live like that. We plan for what we can't control, and things, right, maybe get out of control in our life. We know that because life is uncertain, right? That's a fact of life. But we have to plan for what we want and desire, and we want and desire to have 30 or 40 years after you start working, right? And so yes, it applies to you if you're close to retirement. And yes, it also applies to you if you're 20 or 30 years old. If you get sidestepped by all the nuances that happen in this world, all the naysayers, all the quote unquote experts, as I mentioned, predicting this, that, and the other, you're going to lose sight of the goal, right? I mean, did you know the average bear market, and by the way, a bear market is the rule of thumb is when the stock market goes down or dips below 20%. The average bear market lasts about 1.3 years, while the average bull market lasts around 6.6. Think about that. There's an old saying, bears sound smart, bulls make money. Be careful that you're not following all the naysayers and predicting this, that, and the other. And there may be some half-truths in that, but don't rest your entire retirement plan on that. And I get it. Look, to be fair, if 2022, which was our last bear market, if that was your first time investing, I get it. It can be a gut punch. Don't get me wrong. It's not fun. But as you experience more market cycles, and I can only share this from my experience as an advisor and an investor, okay? I've been in the financial markets, the capital markets for 2 decades now. I've seen a couple bear markets, a couple down years. Even starting in the financial crisis, I've seen government shutdowns. We've seen impeached presidents. We've seen global pandemics. We've seen 3 bear markets in that time period. But as you experience things like anything else in life, right? And if you have more market cycles under your belt, if you will, I'll say this, and I know it's going to sound a little cliche, but it gets easier to ride the wave, if you will, of the market and ultimately build wealth. Again, back to the notion of staying, in the market versus timing the market, right? It matters. Time in the market matters most. And you think about this in context of math for a second, not to bore you, but most of us have a mortgage, right? And if you think about a mortgage, a 30-year fixed mortgage, which a lot of us have, and if you were to open that up, nerds like me have to break this down each year. It's called the amortization schedule. Now, many of you know this, but if you don't, food for thought here, or fact, the first 10 or 11 years of a 30-year, if you looked at it, mostly interest, right? They invert the interest payments first, and then after 10, 11 years, you start seeing your principal start getting paid down. That's the same math you use for your other side of your balance sheet, the wealth building side, when it comes to compound interest. I just sat with a client the other day, and I'll give you an example, right? He's been on working for about 16 years, okay? And he plans to work for another 15 years, so a little over 30 years total. And the first 15 years between his contributions, by the way, in that same time period, he was starting a family, he bought a home, he had amassed about $300,000 in a retirement plan, okay? At that point, when we were meeting a couple weeks ago. And I showed him a very simple calculation of time value of money, which we would do for you and any advisor should be doing for you. And it showed the math. And by the way, I did 15 years, which is how much he wanted to work until he retired. I did an assumed return rate of 5%, very conservative, but it's assumed, not guaranteed, but considerably low. And I did his same contributions as he was doing right now, so I didn't add any dollars to it. And the math at that point was almost $1 million. So he's like, wait a minute, Brad, it took me 15 years to get to 300,000. And you're telling me the next 15 years I'll get almost to $1 million? I said, yeah, compound interest. Think about it like a snowball. You roll it up the hill, you're gaining and gaining more snow, and it gets easier and bigger and bigger. Friends, time in the market is really what matters here. If you just gave up at year 15, right, and you're like, that was a long run, you're only going to amass what you're going to amass at that point. But compound interest starts kicking in just like any other amortization schedule. So as we start this year off, we look at predictions, even the story I mentioned about Tiger Woods and all these people writing him off. Then he goes on and shows him 2 months later, wins by a landslide and becomes the greatest golfer in the world. It does matter what you think, my friends, all right? Do you know the average person, you and I, we have about 40 to 50,000 thoughts a day in our mind, just thoughts, right? I'd ask this question of you, right? I asked this of myself. How many of those thoughts are negative or pessimistic? And by the way, this bleeds into a lot of aspects of our lives, not just money. But then how many of those aspects, how many of those thoughts come back into your money context? And I say context a lot because I think how we perceive and look at wealth building is different than I think how you are likely marketed to in the media in particular, especially social media. And so I think more than anything, if you haven't found an advisor or someone to talk this through with, do so. That's like your first step. If you're looking in the new year, new you, and you get your stuff in order, you want to look at things like your debt and all those are all big, don't get me wrong. But have someone to help you with that. Build trust in someone who's credentialed, a fiduciary, has experience. Find that person because ultimately it's going to be the person who you want in the foxhole with you, right? I mean, obviously you can see from the stats I brought up, to you from last year, no one knows what this market holds this year. And even in bear markets, if it's your first one, you want someone you can lean on, right? But you want to be able to, plan for the uncertain, and you want to make sure that you're doing so like now. So ask yourself another question. Are you ready? Do you feel like your plan and your portfolio is diversified well enough to weather whatever happens this year in 2024, an election year, right? Everyone's talking about it. We're going to talk about that on the show here in a couple weeks as well. So stay tuned for that. But if the answer is, I'm not sure, or it's no, that is a calling, friends. That's where you reach out. Find someone you can trust. The new year is, a great time to do it. It's the first step into, I think, let's start it. I'm going to challenge you. Create that first step in creating a holistic and encompassing wealth management plan that'll gain and grow wealth for you and your family over time. Hey, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, be sure to subscribe to the show and always remember to make your money matter.